Good morning, everyone. Again, it's so nice to see people in the sanctuary and everyone out there in Zoom land and Facebook land. Hello, good morning. My talk title this morning is about letting go. Is your commitment greater than your resistance? That's a mouthful, isn't it? And that talk title, Is Your Commitment Greater Than Your Resistance, is one title that is talked throughout the CSL communities today. So I am really happy to say I have a lot of comrades out there speaking about the same thing today. Last month, I was talking about creating a new story for ourselves. And there were 3 components to that. The first one is to remember who you are, which I talked about last month. The second component was about letting go. And the third component was about intention in creating your new story. The middle one, I think, is the toughest one, letting go. I first would like to take a couple definitions out of the Webster Dictionary that seemed appropriate to explain what Webster has to say about these things. And the first one is resistance. Webster's definition, one of the definitions of resistance, is an act or instance of opposing something, or a refusal to accept something new or different. Commitment, according to Webster's dictionary. Commitment, a dedication to a cause or a belief. Commitment, a willingness to trust and get involved. I remember a couple years ago, our beloved Susan Springfield was here, right here where I'm standing talking. And she was sharing one of her wonderful talks about how the brain works. And in this talk, she was sharing that the brain really loves things that are familiar because it says that it is safe. What is familiar is safe. And our ego says, hey, if it's safe, we're going to survive. So we like safe. We like survival. That's why the ego is there. And when we let go of anything in life, which we all have had to do, a relationship, a dream, a story, there's always a sense of loss, a sense of separation that our ego does not like. No. Letting go of our old story can be difficult, especially if the brain says it's not familiar. No matter how toxic the situation may be, and I know everyone has experienced a toxic situation that involved a lot of pain. Many times in my life, I have chosen something familiar that is very toxic to me over choosing the unknown, the unfamiliar. That seems even more scary than staying with something that isn't good for me. Our story can define us, makes a sense of our ego, of who we are. It's our history. It rationalizes our choices we've made in the past, our past mistakes we think we've made. Trying to get out of not feeling guilty about what and how we have lived our lives sometimes. I was talking to a very good friend of mine this week on Tuesday, and she gave me permission to share. She was sharing about how she wanted to release all the guilt in her life around having to end her relationship with her daughter, who was having so much difficulty in her life with toxic behavior. And the guilt was just overwhelming for her. And yet she knew, and she said these words, and I thought, that is beautiful. She says, I had to choose life over the drama and the toxicity of that relationship. And when I share that with somebody, they go, oh, how could you let go of your daughter? How could you not have a relationship with your daughter, your mother, your brother, your children, your ex, whatever it is, your parents? And I sat with it. She goes, so I'm like trying to ask myself, how do I let go of that guilt? And something came over me and it gave me goosebumps. And I told her, I said, I think you got the G's wrong. And she goes, what? I go, I think you got the G's wrong. It's not guilt. You're experiencing grief. And I was like, wow, grief. The death of something, the death of a dream, of having a relationship with your daughter, of letting go of somebody who's made the transition, a pet. There's so many letting goes that go on. And grieving is an important process to create a new story. Without that, we get stuck. I want to go over something that she said about choosing life and wanting a different outcome. The one thing that I know for sure is the process of grief gets us moving in the right direction. Unresolved issues, unfinished business, unfulfilled dreams, and finally letting go of what just didn't work. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I read her work in the late 70s when I was in college. It was fascinating that she could put words in a process to something we all do and we all have to do, whether we want to or not. The 5 steps that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross shares with us about grieving is number 1, denial. If I could only make them understand, they'll change. If only I loved them enough so they could see their potential. When that doesn't work, we go to anger. Fine, forget it. I'm just not going to try anymore. I don't care. I don't care. Well, when the anger doesn't work anymore, because it takes its course also, we have bargaining. And I've done this one too, many times. God, if you will help me through this, I promise I won't do such and such again. Anyone think of that one sometimes? Only if you would give me one more chance. And then when that runs its course, we are left with depression, guilt, self-hatred, and why me? Why me? Why not them over there? Just kidding. Sorry. And the fifth one in this wonderful process is acceptance. It is what it is. We stop resisting and struggling to make something different. Not guilt, but grieving is our process. Our culture has reinforced self-guilt. When we forgive others, we give ourselves permission to our psyche to forgive ourselves, and only then can we can release ourselves from the suffering and the pain and the sorrow we are experiencing. Letting go of our old story moves us beyond our present situation into new possibilities. Then we can carry our past and hold our past and walk with our past differently. Buddha says that when we are helping others who are suffering and then we begin to suffer, we must then let go. For if we don't, we are no longer free to help eliminate suffering. We no longer can do our work because then we are in the muck and mire. When I was 21 years old, was a long time ago. I fell in love. And the young gentleman was 7 years older than I. He was going to Berkeley, getting a master's degree, and I thought he was the best thing since sliced bread. So, one of my conditions for my parents helping me to go to college was that I didn't go run off to Mexico and get married, you know? So I went off to Mexico and got married. And I got to play house without any support and go to school and experience all that good stuff. Well, 8.5 months later, it fell apart. And we went our ways, lived our lives. And I remember being 21, 22, thinking, what did I do wrong? What could I have done different? And, you know, through my depression and grief of my first love ending. Well, be careful what you wish for. That's all I'm going to say. I did my treatments, my practitioner work at the time, wanting to be back with this person. Well, it took 17 years, but my prayers were answered. And 17 years later, I get a knock on my door, and here is my ex-husband standing there in all his glory, wanting to go to dinner to talk about getting back together. Now, we hadn't had any contact, very little. I talked to his family, really love his family. And I chose to go for it, right? But as I went home that night, I went home and I cried all night long, sobbed. I was like, why is my body, this visceral experience of, no, don't do that. But my ego was like, this time I'll get it right. That's another trap. Thinking being right will make you happy. No, Mom. So, 7 years later, 6.5 to be precise, it fell apart. For the same reasons it fell apart in 8.5 months. I was just actually smarter when I was younger. But it had a lot to do with my ego and society about what it means when something doesn't work out. It's like my failure. What did I do wrong? I don't know about men, but I know for a lot of women, it's, I just didn't do enough. And when we forgive ourselves, we end the cycle of draining our energy in unfinished business. That unfinished business is filled with guilt, shame, and shoulds. And let me tell you, we must never should on ourselves. It's a messy experience. Sometimes the wrong choices we make get us to the right places. It just doesn't fit our pictures. Doggone it. Letting go of our unwanted stuff is about not resisting what is and committing to the possibilities in the present moment. I want to tell a story that was really powerful for me. I was teaching at Gavilan College. I think it was my third year, and my colleague, that was my co-teacher, was pregnant with her second child. And we shared a classroom teaching students who had intellectual disabilities. And we would always discuss things like, man, it must be tough if you are expecting a child and then, you know, you have a child with a disability and you have a different life than you had planned. Well, with her second child, we were really excited. She had a little boy, 2.5, 3 years old, and then she had this beautiful little girl. And she was bringing her over to my house, and I was really excited to meet her. It was just before Christmas. And Taylor was about 2 weeks old. And she calls me up and she says, Tamara, I have to take Taylor to the hospital. She's having petit mal seizures. Now, we work with a lot of young adults with grand mal seizures and petite mal seizures. She knew what that looked like. It's a lot of blinking. So maybe another parent wouldn't have recognized that, but she did. She goes to Kaiser, and after a week of testing, she had a disease called polymicrogyra, which is a lot of words, for the little fingers in the brain being too many. And it caused seizures, terrible, terrible seizures. And they said she would never walk, she would never talk, she would pretty much be a vegetable her whole life, but she would live a very long life because her physical body was healthy. It's a death. It's a death of a dream. It's a death of the expectations of what you want for that child, what you want for your life, for your baby, for you, for the world. And even though we worked with people and their families and students with disabilities, we saw the tough times that can happen, but we also saw the joys and the love. But in that moment, her dreams and her visions of having a healthy child were not there. All I could do is sit there and pray. One of the toughest things is some of the family members were asking me if we could pray that the child would pass so it would end the suffering. I understood where they came from. I could still cry about that to this day. I understood. They loved my friend. They loved their daughter. They didn't want her to suffer. My friend said, no matter what, even if she doesn't ever recognize me, I'm going to keep her home. I'm going to do my best. She goes, but I just pray that she'll recognize me and we can have some type of relationship. So fast forward a couple years. Taylor knows 10 words, and she knows how to throw a temper tantrum. And she's got these big blue eyes, and she's just adorable. And she can't walk. And she has difficulty talking. Well, Shireen was going to the Rotary Club, which was all men. I'm sure you guys seen those type of clubs, a lot of businessmen there, and they donate money to different organizations. And so for the polymicrogyra disease, she was raising money. So she was going to go talk, and she wanted me to support her. And she said, I'm not going to cry. I'm going to be tough. It's a lot of men out there, and I'm just going to share the facts. And I said, you're asking for money. You got to touch their heart. You got to be vulnerable. That's not going to get them deep in their pockets, So, so we started looking for stories that she could tell without having it directly just about her, because that would have been too emotional. We found a story together. I'll never forget this. We were sitting in her office, and the story was about a man who had a child born with a disability. And he related to that story of the process he went through to this. He said, it was like when my son was born, it was like we were expecting him to grow up, get married, have children, take care of us in our old age. And he goes, so he related it to expecting to go to Paris. You're going to see the Eiffel Tower, people are going to speak French, you're going to go to the Louvre, and you think those milestones or that journey is supposed to look this way. How many of you in here have thought your life was supposed to look one way, and it did not end up looking that way at all? So, he said, we forget as parents or as people in whatever situation that his son was still going to have a journey, and they were still going to have milestones, ups and downs and joys and pain and love. But they weren't going to go to Paris anymore. They had to pack their bag. They had to pack their dreams. And he says to go to Holland. And they were going to go see, windmills and wear wooden shoes. And it's the idea that when we pack our mind filled with what should be instead of what is, we can trip over ourselves. And that story, I remember I was sitting there, and there was a lot of men in there, and about 100, and she was talking, and then she showed a picture of her beautiful daughter who just took away all the ideas of what a child with a disability might look like. And she was so beautiful, and the checks were flying, people were taking money out of their wallets, and it was a good day. But it was a great story for me, for my own life. Charles Fillmore, he was the founder, Charles and Merrill Fillmore, they were the founders of Unity. He says, "Let forgiveness be your daily blessing." And I'm jumping to forgiveness from grief, because once that process of grief is done, there's a whole lot of forgiveness to go around. And first with ourselves, and secondly with everybody else. And I mean everybody else. He says that what he did is he committed to forgive as a daily blessing to every person he saw in every moment. He suggests a spiritual practice of letting go is based in forgiveness. Silently, he said to every person he passed, "I forgive you." This permits us and those we say it to peacefully enter to wherever we are going. Because once one person has forgiven themselves or feels forgiven, they are no longer in the process of grieving and angry. I like that a lot. When we err is not truth. Error, not truth, causes our suffering. Now, Jesus talked about that in his language in Aramaic. Jesus talked about what sin was. And in the language of Aramaic, Jesus talked about sin no more. And when the translation of sin comes up in Aramaic, it was a term for archery. And in this, when you sinned, you missed the mark. You didn't hit the mark in archery. So when he said, "Go and sin no more," he was talking about go and recognize, forgive yourself, recognize, and try not to make any more mistakes like that. That's all we could ask of ourselves, right? Letting go, we no longer hold on to the lies we've told ourselves, but to the truth. Because in truth, we can never be separated from who we really are. The ego tells us that, but it's not true. The essence of who we are, that is never born and never dies, that truth, that essence of spirit, it is the foundation of remembering that we are more than just this body, these five senses. Reverend Deborah used to say that the only thing that ever needs healing is our sense of separation, because we cannot be separated from who we are. It's impossible. Our ego's just doing the best it can in our bodies. Let the past not bind you. Let your old story not limit you. I invite you to let go of your limitations. Let go of your limitation of your own errors in your mind, because that's where it all is. It's in our mind. We create our own story. Surrender into your intuition. And this is really important because it's not our thinking mind that gets us out of trouble and into our spirituality. It is our intuition, our instinct in remembering who we are. Listen for your spirit to connect to love. For love is the ultimate bridge which all things then become known to us. And in closing, instead of a prayer, I always like to find something from a different culture. And this is from unknown Native American poem. And I'm saying this because I find that we get to stay in the mystery of life, and we don't have to figure everything out. And our stories can be messy, but they can be beautiful, and we let go of what doesn't work so we can bring in more possibilities, right? So here is this beautiful poem. O mystery of mysteries, let me not forget who I am and why I have come here and why I will go. Let me be open to all mysteries while I am here on Mother Earth, so I can stay connected to all the sacred and all the living creatures. Namaste. Thank you for having me.